Welcome back to our journey into the darkest corners of forgotten history, where we uncover the stories that powerful forces tried to bury forever. Today, we dive into a case so disturbing, so fundamentally challenging to the moral fabric of 1890s America, that it was systematically erased from every history book, every newspaper archive, and every official record you might hope to find. This is the story of Eleanor Holloway, a woman whose very existence became an inconvenient truth that an entire nation conspired to forget. What began as whispered rumors in the remote Ozark Hills of Arkansas would eventually reach the highest levels of government, threatening to expose a network of corruption, murder, and unspeakable experiments that stretched from isolated mountain communities to the marble halls of Washington, D.C. Before we begin this descent into one of America's most carefully hidden scandals, I want you to understand something crucial. Everything you're about to hear has been pieced together from fragments, from documents that survived purely by accident, from testimonies that were never meant to see the light of day. The official story, the one taught in schools and universities, claims that Eleanor Holloway never existed. But the evidence tells a very different tale. Now let's journey back to the autumn of 1891, to a time when the American frontier was closing, when the country was transforming from a collection of rural communities into an industrial powerhouse, and when certain individuals discovered that in the chaos of this transformation, the most heinous crimes could be committed with virtual impunity. The Ozark Mountains of Arkansas in 1891 were a world unto themselves, a labyrinth of hidden valleys and forgotten hollows where families had lived in isolation for generations. It was a place where the federal government's reach was tenuous at best, where local law was often dispensed by whoever had the most guns and the least conscience, and where a person could disappear without anyone in the outside world ever knowing they had existed. It was into this harsh and unforgiving landscape that Eleanor Holloway was born on a bitter February morning in 1867, the daughter of Jeremiah Holloway, a man whose reputation for violence was matched only by his skill at avoiding the consequences of that violence. The Holloway family had settled in what locals called Devil's Backbone Ridge, a narrow spine of rock and pine that jutted up from the valley floor like the fossilized remains of some prehistoric monster. Jeremiah Holloway was not a man who inspired affection, even among his own family. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with arms like tree trunks and hands that could crush a man's windpipe without apparent effort, he ruled his household with the same iron fist he used to control the illegal whiskey operation that provided the family's primary income. But it wasn't just his physical presence that made Jeremiah feared throughout the region. It was his eyes, pale blue and utterly devoid of warmth, that seemed to look right through a person, as if calculating exactly how much pain he could inflict before they stopped being useful to him. Eleanor's mother, Sarah, had been barely 16 when Jeremiah claimed her from her family, paying her father 3 bottles of corn liquor and a promise not to burn down their cabin. Sarah Holloway was a broken woman. By the time Eleanor was old enough to remember her clearly, a ghost who moved through the house performing her duties with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned that the smallest mistake could result in a beating that might last for hours. But Eleanor was different from the beginning. Where her mother had been crushed by Jeremiah's brutality, Eleanor seemed to absorb it, to study it, to learn from it. By the age of 10, she could field dress a deer faster than most grown men. By 12, she could track a wounded animal through terrain that would challenge an experienced hunter. And by 14, she had killed her first human being. The victim was a revenue agent named Thomas Whitmore, a young man from Little Rock who had been sent to investigate reports of illegal distilling operations in the Ozark region. Whitmore had made the fatal mistake of approaching the Holloway compound alone, confident that his federal badge would provide sufficient protection. He was wrong. According to the only surviving account of the incident, found in a letter written by Eleanor herself years later, Whitmore had been captured by Jeremiah and his sons while attempting to photograph the family's still operation. What followed was 3 days of torture that would have challenged the imagination of the Spanish Inquisition. But it was Eleanor who delivered the killing blow, using a technique her father had taught her that involved inserting a thin blade between the victim's ribs in such a way that death would be slow and agonizing. The murder of Thomas Whitmore should have brought the full weight of federal law enforcement down on the Holloway family, but something extraordinary happened instead. The investigation was quietly dropped. Whitmore's death was attributed to a hunting accident. His body was never recovered, and the Holloway family continued their operations as if nothing had happened. This was Eleanor's first lesson in the power of corruption, in the understanding that the right connections and the right amount of money could make even the most serious crimes disappear. It was a lesson she would apply with devastating effectiveness in the years to come. By 1885, Eleanor had grown into a woman of striking and unsettling beauty. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with her father's pale blue eyes and her mother's delicate features, she possessed a presence that was simultaneously magnetic and terrifying. Men found themselves drawn to her despite an instinctive understanding that she represented danger on a fundamental level. Women, perhaps more perceptive to the predatory nature that lurked beneath Eleanor's carefully cultivated facade, tended to avoid her entirely. It was during this period that Eleanor began to expand her activities beyond the family's traditional moonshining operation. She had observed that the isolated nature of the Ozark region made it an ideal location for activities that required absolute secrecy, and she had also noticed that there were individuals in the outside world who were willing to pay extraordinary sums for services that could not be obtained through conventional means. Eleanor's first major client was a man named Cornelius Blackwood, a railroad magnate from Chicago who had built his fortune through a combination of political corruption, intimidation, and the occasional strategic murder. Blackwood had a problem that conventional solutions could not address. His business partner, a man named Harrison Steele, had discovered evidence of Blackwood's involvement in a series of train derailments that had killed dozens of passengers. Steele was threatening to go to the authorities unless Blackwood agreed to sell his share of their railroad company for a fraction of its true value. Blackwood needed Steele to disappear in a way that would not raise suspicions, and he needed it done by someone who could never be connected to him. Through a network of contacts that stretched from the Chicago underworld to the corrupt political machines of Arkansas, Blackwood learned about Eleanor Holloway and her unique qualifications. The meeting between Blackwood and Eleanor took place in the autumn of 1885 in the abandoned cabin deep in the Ozark wilderness. Blackwood had expected to find a crude mountain woman who could be easily manipulated and discarded once her usefulness had ended. Instead, he found himself face to face with a woman whose intelligence and sophistication were matched only by her obvious capacity for violence. Eleanor listened to Blackwood's proposal with the detached interest of a surgeon examining a particularly challenging case. When he finished speaking, she quoted him a price that made him gasp. $50,000, an enormous sum in 1885, equivalent to well over $1 million today. But Eleanor's terms were non-negotiable, half the money up front, half upon completion of the job. And if Blackwood ever attempted to betray her or reveal her involvement, she would personally ensure that his death would make Harrison Steele's fate seem merciful by comparison. Blackwood agreed to Eleanor's terms, though he privately planned to eliminate her once Steele was dead. It was a decision he would come to regret in ways he could never have imagined. Harrison Steele disappeared on a foggy November evening while walking home from his club in downtown Chicago. His body was never found, and the police investigation concluded that he had likely been the victim of a random robbery gone wrong. But those who knew Steele understood that something far more sinister had occurred. The man had simply vanished, as if he had never existed, leaving behind only a few personal effects and a growing sense of unease among those who had known him. What Blackwood didn't know was that Eleanor had not simply killed Harrison Steele. She had taken him alive back to Arkansas, where she had spent weeks conducting what she called experiments. Eleanor had become fascinated by the limits of human endurance, both physical and psychological. She wanted to understand how much pain a person could experience before their mind simply shut down. How long someone could be kept alive while undergoing systematic torture, and what psychological techniques could be used to break a person's will completely. Steele became the first subject in what Eleanor would later refer to as her research program. For 3 weeks, she kept him alive in a specially constructed chamber beneath the Holloway compound, subjecting him to tortures that combined medieval brutality with a scientific precision that was decades ahead of its time. She documented everything meticulously, keeping detailed notes on Steele's responses to different stimuli, his psychological deterioration, and the various methods she employed to keep him conscious and aware throughout the ordeal. When Steele finally died, Eleanor felt a sense of satisfaction that went far beyond the financial compensation she had received from Blackwood. She had discovered her true calling, her purpose in life. She was not simply a killer for hire. She was a researcher, an explorer of the darkest territories of human experience, and she had found a way to pursue her research while accumulating the wealth and power necessary to protect herself from the consequences of her actions. Word of Eleanor's capabilities spread quickly through the shadowy networks that connected America's criminal and political elite. By 1887, she was receiving requests for her services from clients across the country. A senator from New York needed a troublesome journalist to disappear. A mining company owner in Colorado wanted a union organizer eliminated in a way that would terrorize other potential troublemakers. A judge in New Orleans required the permanent silencing of a witness who could expose his involvement in a massive corruption scheme. Eleanor accepted these contracts selectively, choosing only those that offered the greatest financial reward and the most interesting opportunities for her research. She developed a reputation for absolute discretion and complete reliability. When Eleanor Holloway accepted a contract, the target would disappear without a trace, and no amount of investigation would ever reveal what had happened to them. But Eleanor was not content to simply fulfill contracts for others. She had begun to develop her own agenda, her own vision of how her unique talents could be used to reshape the world according to her desires. She had observed that the rapid changes occurring in American society during the 1880s and 1890s created opportunities for someone with her skills and lack of moral constraints to accumulate unprecedented power and influence. The key, Eleanor realized, was information. In an age when communication was slow and unreliable, when records were often incomplete or easily falsified, someone who could gather and control information about the secret activities of powerful individuals could wield enormous influence. And Eleanor had discovered that her research subjects, when properly motivated, could provide extraordinarily detailed information about the hidden activities of America's elite. By 1889, Eleanor had established what she called her information network, a web of contacts and informants that stretched from the halls of Congress to the boardrooms of major corporations. She had also constructed a sophisticated facility beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge, a complex of chambers and laboratories where she could conduct her research without fear of discovery or interruption. The facility, which Eleanor referred to as her institute, was a marvel of engineering and psychological design. Built into the living rock of the mountain, it consisted of dozens of rooms connected by a maze of tunnels that only Eleanor fully understood. The main laboratory was equipped with devices that would not have been out of place in a modern torture chamber, instruments of precision and cruelty that Eleanor had designed herself based on her years of experimentation. But the Institute was more than just a place of torture and death. It was also a center of learning, where Eleanor studied the latest developments in psychology, medicine, and technology. She maintained an extensive library of books and journals, many of them obtained through her network of contacts in academic and government circles. She corresponded with researchers and theorists around the world, always careful to conceal her true identity and the nature of her work. Eleanor's research during this period focused on what she called the science of control. She was developing techniques for breaking down a person's psychological defenses, for extracting information that subjects didn't even know they possessed, and for creating a state of complete mental and physical submission. Her methods combined physical torture with sophisticated psychological manipulation, creating a system that was far more effective than anything that had been developed before. The subjects for Eleanor's research came from various sources. Some were individuals who had been contracted for elimination by her clients. Others were people who had simply had the misfortune to attract Eleanor's attention, travelers who had become lost in the Ozark wilderness, drifters and vagrants who would not be missed by anyone. Eleanor was particularly interested in subjects who possessed specialized knowledge or skills, individuals whose expertise could be extracted and added to her growing understanding of how the world really worked. One of Eleanor's most valuable subjects during this period was a man named Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a physician and researcher who had been conducting secret experiments for the federal government. Thornfield had been developing techniques for interrogation and control that were intended for use against foreign agents and domestic dissidents. When he began to have second thoughts about the ethical implications of his work, he made the mistake of attempting to expose the government's involvement in his research. Thornfield disappeared while traveling to Washington, D.C., to meet with a journalist who had promised to help him reveal the truth about the government's secret programs. He ended up in Eleanor's institute, where he spent the final 6 months of his life sharing everything he knew about the government's research into mind control, interrogation techniques, and psychological warfare. Through Thornfield, Eleanor learned that her own research was far more advanced than anything being conducted by official government agencies. She also discovered that there were individuals within the federal government who would be very interested in her techniques and very willing to pay for access to them. This revelation opened up an entirely new avenue for Eleanor's activities, one that would eventually lead to her involvement with some of the most powerful and dangerous individuals in American government. Eleanor's first contact with federal agents occurred in the spring of 1890, when she was approached by a man named Colonel James Morrison, an officer in the Army's intelligence division who had learned about her capabilities through channels that he never fully explained. Morrison represented a faction within the government that was concerned about the growing influence of foreign agents and domestic radicals. They needed someone who could extract information from captured subjects using methods that could never be officially acknowledged or traced back to the government. The arrangement that Eleanor negotiated with Morrison was extraordinarily lucrative and gave her access to resources and protection that she had never possessed before. In exchange for providing interrogation and elimination services to Morrison's organization, Eleanor would receive not only substantial financial compensation, but also official protection from law enforcement and access to government intelligence that would help her expand her own operations. Eleanor's first assignment from Morrison involved a suspected anarchist named Viktor Petrov, a Russian immigrant who was believed to be planning an assassination attempt against President Benjamin Harrison. Petrov had been captured by federal agents, but conventional interrogation methods had failed to extract any useful information from him. Morrison needed to know the details of Petrov's plan, the identities of his co-conspirators, and the location of any weapons or explosives that might have been hidden. Petrov was transported to Eleanor's institute under cover of darkness, officially listed as having died while attempting to escape from federal custody. What followed was a masterpiece of psychological and physical manipulation that lasted for nearly a month. Eleanor systematically broke down every aspect of Petrov's identity and belief system, using techniques that combined extreme physical pain with sophisticated psychological warfare. The information that Eleanor extracted from Petrov revealed a conspiracy that was far more extensive than Morrison's organization had suspected. Petrov was not simply a lone anarchist, but part of a network of foreign agents who were planning a series of coordinated attacks against government officials and industrial targets. The intelligence that Eleanor provided allowed federal agents to prevent multiple assassinations and terrorist attacks, saving countless lives and preserving the stability of the government. Morrison was so impressed with Eleanor's results that he immediately began planning additional assignments for her. Over the following months, Eleanor processed dozens of subjects for the government, extracting information that was used to prevent crimes, identify foreign agents, and eliminate threats to national security. Her techniques became so effective that Morrison's organization began to rely on her services almost exclusively for their most sensitive operations. But Eleanor was not content to simply serve as a contractor for the government. She had her own agenda, her own vision of how her capabilities could be used to reshape American society according to her desires. She began to use her access to government intelligence to identify opportunities for her own advancement, targeting individuals whose elimination would benefit her interests, while also serving the government's purposes. Eleanor's most ambitious project during this period involved the systematic elimination of a network of journalists and reformers who were investigating corruption in federal agencies. These individuals posed a threat not only to the government officials who were Eleanor's clients, but also to Eleanor herself, since their investigations might eventually uncover evidence of her activities. Working with Morrison's organization, Eleanor developed a plan to eliminate these threats in a way that would appear to be the result of natural causes, accidents, or random crimes. The campaign against the journalists and reformers was carried out over a period of 18 months. From late 1890 to early 1892, Eleanor personally handled the most sensitive eliminations, while using her network of contacts and subordinates to arrange the deaths of less important targets. The methods employed were varied and sophisticated, ranging from poisonings that mimicked natural diseases to staged accidents that appeared completely random. One of the most notable victims was a journalist named Samuel Richardson, who had been investigating irregularities in government contracts related to military supplies. Richardson had discovered evidence that certain officials were deliberately purchasing defective equipment that resulted in the deaths of soldiers while pocketing the money that should have been spent on proper supplies. His investigation was getting close to exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the War Department. Richardson's death was arranged to look like a heart attack, accomplished through the use of a rare poison that Eleanor had developed based on her research into various plant and animal toxins found in the Ozark region. The poison was administered through a specially prepared cigar that was delivered to Richardson by someone posing as an admirer of his work. Richardson died at his desk while working on his final article about the military supply scandal, and his death was attributed to the stress of overwork. Another significant elimination was that of Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a physician and social reformer who had been documenting the mistreatment of patients in government-run mental institutions. Dr. Hartwell had discovered that certain facilities were being used for unauthorized medical experiments, including tests of drugs and procedures that were designed to control or modify human behavior. Her research threatened to expose not only the illegal experiments, but also the involvement of federal agencies in funding and directing this research. Dr. Hartwell's death was staged to appear as a suicide, accomplished through the use of psychological manipulation techniques that Eleanor had perfected during her years of research. Eleanor spent several weeks studying Dr. Hartwell's habits and psychological profile, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited to drive her to take her own life. The process involved a carefully orchestrated campaign of harassment and intimidation that gradually broke down Dr. Hartwell's mental defenses, culminating in her apparent suicide by overdose of morphine. The success of these operations established Eleanor as one of the most valuable assets in the government's covert arsenal. But it also attracted the attention of individuals who represented an even higher level of power and influence than Colonel Morrison and his organization. In the summer of 1891, Eleanor was contacted by a man who identified himself only as Mr. Ashford, a representative of what he described as a private organization that served the interests of America's most powerful families and corporations. Ashford's organization, which Eleanor would later learn, was connected to some of the wealthiest and most influential individuals in the country, had been monitoring her activities with great interest. They had concluded that Eleanor's unique combination of skills, resources, and lack of moral constraints made her an ideal candidate for their most sensitive operations. They were prepared to offer her compensation and protection that far exceeded anything she had received from the government, but they also expected a level of commitment and discretion that would effectively make her their exclusive property. The meeting between Eleanor and Ashford took place in a private railroad car that had been specially modified for secure communications. Ashford was a thin, pale man with the kind of refined mannerisms that suggested a background in diplomacy or high-level business negotiations. He spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who was accustomed to having his words treated as commands, and he made it clear from the beginning that Eleanor's acceptance of his organization's offer was not really a matter of choice. Ashford's organization, which he referred to only as the Consortium, represented the interests of families and corporations that had accumulated vast wealth and power during America's rapid industrialization. These individuals had concluded that the traditional mechanisms of government and law enforcement were inadequate for protecting their interests in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. They needed their own private army, their own intelligence network, and their own methods for eliminating threats that could not be addressed through conventional means. Eleanor's role in the consortium would be to serve as their primary specialist for what Ashford euphemistically called problem resolution. She would be responsible for gathering intelligence on threats to consortium interests, developing strategies for neutralizing these threats, and personally handling the most sensitive elimination operations. In exchange, she would receive financial compensation that would make her one of the wealthiest individuals in America, along with protection and resources that would allow her to expand her research activities far beyond anything she had previously imagined. The offer was attractive, but Eleanor was not naive about the implications of accepting it. She understood that working for the consortium would effectively end her independence and make her a prisoner of their interests, regardless of how luxurious her prison might be. She also recognized that the consortium's reach and influence were so extensive that refusing their offer might result in her own elimination. After careful consideration, Eleanor agreed to work with the consortium, but she negotiated terms that would allow her to maintain some degree of autonomy and continue her research activities. She would establish a new facility, far more sophisticated than her institute in Arkansas, where she could conduct operations for the consortium while also pursuing her own scientific interests. The consortium would provide funding and resources for this facility, but Eleanor would retain control over its day-to-day operations and research programs. The new facility was constructed in a remote valley in the Colorado Rockies, disguised as a private sanitarium for wealthy individuals suffering from nervous disorders. The location was chosen for its isolation and the natural barriers that would make unauthorized access virtually impossible. The facility was officially known as the Ashford Institute for Mental Health, but Eleanor privately referred to it as her laboratory. The laboratory was a masterpiece of engineering and design, incorporating the latest advances in architecture, technology, and security. The main building appeared to be a luxurious resort hotel, complete with elegant guest rooms, dining facilities, and recreational areas. But beneath this facade lay a complex of underground chambers and laboratories, where Eleanor could conduct her research without any possibility of discovery or interference. The laboratory's research facilities were far more sophisticated than anything Eleanor had possessed in Arkansas. She now had access to the latest medical equipment, chemical laboratories, and psychological testing apparatus. She also had a staff of carefully selected assistants, individuals who had been recruited for their specialized skills and their willingness to participate in activities that would be considered criminal by conventional standards. Eleanor's first major project at the laboratory involved the development of what she called enhanced interrogation techniques, methods for extracting information that were far more effective than anything that had been developed before. These techniques combined physical torture with sophisticated psychological manipulation, using insights from the emerging field of psychology to break down a subject's mental defenses in ways that were both faster and more complete than traditional methods. The subjects for Eleanor's research at the laboratory came from various sources. Some were individuals who had been targeted for elimination by the consortium, people whose deaths had been ordered, but who possessed information that needed to be extracted first. Others were subjects who had been specifically acquired for research purposes, individuals who had been kidnapped or lured to the facility under false pretenses. One of Eleanor's most significant research subjects during this period was a man named Professor Jonathan Whitmore, a psychologist and researcher who had been developing theories about human behavior and mental control that were decades ahead of their time. Whitmore had been working on techniques for modifying human behavior through a combination of psychological conditioning and chemical intervention, research that had attracted the attention of both government agencies and private organizations. When Whitmore began to have ethical concerns about the potential applications of his research, he made the mistake of attempting to publish his findings in a way that would expose the involvement of his secret sponsors. The consortium decided that Whitmore represented too great a risk to be allowed to continue his work, but they also recognized that his knowledge could be extremely valuable if it could be extracted and controlled. Whitmore was lured to the laboratory under the pretense of being offered a position as head of research at a prestigious private institution. Once he arrived, he was imprisoned and subjected to months of interrogation and experimentation that gradually extracted every detail of his research while also serving as a test of the techniques he had developed. Through her work with Whitmore, Eleanor learned about advances in psychology and behavior modification that revolutionized her understanding of human mental processes. She discovered techniques for breaking down psychological defenses that were far more effective than the crude methods she had developed through trial and error. She also learned about chemical compounds that could be used to enhance the effectiveness of interrogation and to create states of mental submission that were virtually impossible to resist. Eleanor's research during this period also focused on the development of what she called control protocols, systematic methods for creating and maintaining psychological dominance over subjects. These protocols were designed to be used not only for interrogation purposes, but also for the long-term control of individuals who needed to be kept alive but completely submissive. The control protocols were tested on a variety of subjects, including political prisoners, captured foreign agents, and individuals who had been kidnapped specifically for research purposes. Eleanor discovered that with the proper combination of psychological conditioning, chemical intervention, and environmental control, it was possible to completely break down a person's sense of individual identity and replace it with a programmed set of responses that could be controlled by the operator. These techniques proved to be extraordinarily effective for the consortium's purposes. They could be used to extract information from captured enemies, to control potential witnesses who might threaten consortium interests, and to create agents who could be inserted into target organizations without any risk of betrayal or discovery. Eleanor's success with the control protocols led to her being assigned increasingly important and sensitive operations by the consortium. She was asked to handle the elimination of a Supreme Court justice who was threatening to rule against consortium interests in a major case involving railroad monopolies. She was tasked with extracting information from a foreign diplomat who was believed to be coordinating espionage activities against American industrial targets. She was ordered to develop a plan for the systematic elimination of a group of labor organizers who were threatening to expose unsafe working conditions in consortium-owned factories. Each of these operations was carried out with the precision and efficiency that had become Eleanor's trademark. The Supreme Court justice died of an apparent heart attack while reviewing case files in his private study. The foreign diplomat disappeared while traveling between cities. His body never recovered. The labor organizers died in what appeared to be a series of unrelated accidents and illnesses that occurred over a period of several months. But Eleanor's most significant operation for the consortium involved a threat that was far more dangerous than any individual target. In late 1891, a group of journalists and government investigators had begun to piece together evidence of a vast conspiracy involving corruption, murder, and illegal experimentation that reached into the highest levels of American society. This investigation threatened to expose not only the consortium's activities, but also Eleanor's role in carrying out their operations. The investigation was being led by a journalist named Marcus Brennan, a man whose reputation for integrity and persistence had made him one of the most respected reporters in the country. Brennan had been working on the story for over a year, gradually accumulating evidence and testimony that painted a picture of systematic corruption and criminality that would have shocked the American public if it had ever been published. Brennan's investigation had identified several key elements of the conspiracy, including the existence of secret government programs for interrogation and assassination, the involvement of wealthy private individuals in illegal activities, and the operation of clandestine facilities where horrific experiments were being conducted on human subjects. He had not yet identified Eleanor specifically, but his investigation was getting close to uncovering evidence that would inevitably lead to her. The consortium decided that Brennan and his entire investigation team needed to be eliminated, but they also recognized that the deaths of such prominent individuals would need to be handled with extraordinary care. If Brennan and his colleagues died under suspicious circumstances, it would only fuel speculation about the conspiracy they had been investigating and might lead to even more dangerous revelations. Eleanor was tasked with developing a plan that would eliminate Brennan and his team while making their deaths appear to be the result of natural causes or accidents that were completely unrelated to their investigation. The operation would need to be carried out over a period of several months to avoid suspicion, and it would require the coordination of resources and personnel across multiple states. Eleanor's plan was a masterpiece of strategic thinking and operational planning. She identified the key members of Brennan's investigation team and developed individualized elimination strategies for each of them. She arranged for the acquisition of subjects who could be used to test and refine the methods that would be employed. She coordinated with consortium resources to ensure that the necessary materials and personnel would be available when needed. The operation began in December 1891 with the elimination of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a physician who had been providing Brennan with information about suspicious deaths that might be connected to the conspiracy. Dr. Mitchell died of what appeared to be influenza, but the illness was actually caused by a biological agent that Eleanor had developed based on her research into infectious diseases. The agent was designed to mimic the symptoms of common illnesses while being virtually impossible to detect using the medical knowledge and technology available in 1891. Over the following months, Eleanor systematically eliminated the other members of Brennan's team using a variety of methods that were carefully chosen to appear unrelated to each other. A government clerk who had been providing inside information died in a house fire that was attributed to a faulty chimney. A telegraph operator who had been monitoring communications died of apparent food poisoning after eating at a restaurant that had never had any previous problems with contamination. A private investigator who had been gathering evidence died when his horse threw him during what appeared to be a routine ride through the countryside. Each elimination was planned and executed with meticulous attention to detail, using methods that would not raise suspicion even among individuals who were specifically looking for evidence of foul play. Eleanor had learned from her years of research that the key to successful assassination was not just the method of killing, but the creation of a complete narrative that would explain the death in a way that satisfied investigators and prevented further inquiry. Marcus Brennan himself was the final target, and Eleanor saved him for last because she wanted to extract every piece of information he had gathered about the conspiracy before eliminating him. Brennan was lured to what he believed was a secret meeting with a high-level government source who promised to provide him with definitive proof of the conspiracy he had been investigating. The meeting was arranged to take place at a remote cabin in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, a location that was chosen for its isolation and the natural barriers that would prevent any possibility of rescue or escape. Brennan arrived at the cabin expecting to meet with his source, but instead found himself face-to-face with Eleanor Holloway. What followed was a 3-week period of interrogation and torture that extracted every detail of Brennan's investigation, while also serving as a final test of the techniques Eleanor had developed over her years of research. Brennan was a strong-willed and intelligent man who had faced danger before, but he was completely unprepared for the systematic psychological and physical assault that Eleanor unleashed upon him. Eleanor's interrogation of Brennan revealed that his investigation had been even more comprehensive than the consortium had realized. He had identified not only the existence of the conspiracy, but also many of the specific individuals involved, including several members of the consortium's leadership. He had also discovered evidence of Eleanor's activities, though he had not yet connected her to the larger conspiracy. Most disturbing of all, Brennan had been preparing to publish his findings in a series of articles that would have exposed the entire conspiracy to public scrutiny. He had already written several drafts of these articles and had made arrangements with multiple newspapers to ensure that the story would be published, even if something happened to him. Eleanor realized that eliminating Brennan would not be sufficient to protect the conspiracy. She would also need to locate and destroy all of his research materials, eliminate anyone else who might have knowledge of his findings, and create a cover story that would explain his disappearance in a way that would not generate further investigation. Working with consortium resources, Eleanor orchestrated a complex operation that involved breaking into Brennan's home and office to steal his research materials, bribing or intimidating newspaper editors to prevent publication of his articles, and eliminating several additional individuals who might have had knowledge of his investigation. The operation required the coordination of dozens of agents and the expenditure of enormous resources, but it was ultimately successful in containing the threat that Brennan's investigation had represented. Brennan's own death was staged to appear as if he had suffered a mental breakdown and committed suicide while traveling in the wilderness. His body was found at the bottom of a cliff in the Adirondack Mountains, along with a suicide note that explained his death as the result of depression and professional disappointment. The note was written in Brennan's own handwriting, produced through techniques that Eleanor had developed for creating authentic-looking documents using psychological coercion. The elimination of Brennan and his investigation team marked the end of the most serious threat that the consortium had faced, but it also represented a turning point in Eleanor's relationship with her employers. The success of the operation had demonstrated her value to the consortium, but it had also revealed the extent of her knowledge about their activities and her potential to become a threat herself. Eleanor was aware of this shift in her relationship with the consortium, and she began to take steps to protect herself from the possibility that they might decide to eliminate her. She started to develop her own independent resources and intelligence networks, creating backup plans and escape routes that would allow her to survive if the consortium turned against her. Eleanor's preparations proved to be prescient because by early 1892, certain members of the consortium had indeed begun to view her as a potential liability. They recognized that Eleanor's knowledge of their activities made her extremely dangerous, and they were concerned that her growing independence might eventually lead her to betray them or attempt to use her knowledge for her own purposes. The decision to eliminate Eleanor was made at a secret meeting of the consortium's leadership in February 1892. The operation was planned with the same care and attention to detail that Eleanor herself would have used, involving multiple backup plans and contingencies to ensure that she could not escape or retaliate. But Eleanor had not survived for so many years without developing an acute sense of danger and an ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. She had been monitoring the consortium's communications and activities through her own intelligence network, and she had detected signs that her employers were planning to move against her. Rather than wait for the consortium to act, Eleanor decided to strike first. She had spent months developing a plan that would allow her to eliminate the consortium's leadership while also destroying their organization and protecting herself from retaliation. The plan was ambitious and dangerous, but Eleanor had concluded that it represented her only chance for survival and continued independence. Eleanor's plan involved the systematic elimination of the consortium's key leaders, combined with the release of information that would expose their activities to public scrutiny and government investigation. She had compiled detailed dossiers on each member of the consortium's leadership, documenting their involvement in illegal activities and their connections to various crimes and conspiracies. The operation began in March 1892 with the elimination of Mr. Ashford, the man who had originally recruited Eleanor to work for the consortium. Ashford died of apparent heart failure while attending a private dinner party at his estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The death was attributed to natural causes, but it was actually the result of a poison that Eleanor had developed specifically for the purpose of eliminating high-profile targets without raising suspicion. Over the following months, Eleanor systematically eliminated the other members of the consortium's leadership using a variety of methods that were designed to appear unrelated to each other. A railroad magnate died in a train derailment that appeared to be the result of mechanical failure. A steel industry baron died of apparent food poisoning after eating at an exclusive restaurant. A banking executive died when his carriage overturned during what appeared to be a routine journey through Central Park. Each elimination was accompanied by the strategic release of information that exposed the victim's involvement in illegal activities and corruption. Eleanor had arranged for evidence to be delivered to journalists, government investigators, and law enforcement officials in a way that would ensure maximum publicity and investigation while protecting her own identity and involvement. The systematic destruction of the consortium's leadership created chaos within their organization and led to a series of investigations and scandals that dominated newspaper headlines for months. The revelations about corruption and criminality among America's elite shocked the public and led to demands for reform and accountability that reached into the highest levels of government. But Eleanor's war against the consortium also attracted the attention of government agencies that had their own reasons for wanting to eliminate her. Her activities had exposed not only private corruption, but also government involvement in illegal programs and operations. Federal agents and military intelligence officers who had worked with Eleanor in the past now viewed her as a threat that needed to be neutralized. The hunt for Eleanor Holloway became one of the most intensive manhunts in American history, involving resources from multiple government agencies and private organizations. Hundreds of agents and investigators were assigned to track her down, using every available method of surveillance and investigation to locate her hiding places and predict her movements. But Eleanor had spent years preparing for exactly this situation. She had established multiple identities and safe houses across the country. She had developed networks of contacts and resources that could provide her with assistance and protection. Most importantly, she had accumulated enough information about government and private corruption to ensure that her elimination would result in the exposure of secrets that powerful individuals were desperate to protect. The manhunt for Eleanor continued throughout 1892 and into 1893, but despite the enormous resources devoted to finding her, she managed to stay one step ahead of her pursuers. She continued to carry out selective operations against targets who posed threats to her survival, while also releasing information that kept government and private investigators focused on cleaning up the scandals she had exposed rather than hunting for her. Eleanor's ability to evade capture was aided by the fact that many of the individuals who were hunting her had their own secrets that she could expose if they got too close. She had developed a strategy of mutually assured destruction, making it clear that her death would result in the automatic release of information that would destroy the careers and lives of anyone who had been involved in the conspiracy against her. By late 1893, the intensity of the manhunt had begun to diminish as government and private resources were redirected toward dealing with the ongoing scandals and investigations that Eleanor's revelations had triggered. Many of the individuals who had been most eager to eliminate her had themselves become targets of investigation or had been forced to resign from their positions in disgrace. Eleanor used this breathing space to establish a more permanent base of operations in a location that would provide her with security and resources, while also allowing her to continue her research activities. She chose a remote area of the Montana Territory, where she constructed a facility that was even more sophisticated than her previous laboratories. The Montana facility was designed to be completely self-sufficient and virtually impossible to detect or assault. It was built into a natural cave system that had been expanded and modified to create a complex of laboratories, living quarters, and defensive positions. The facility was supplied through a network of hidden supply routes and was protected by a combination of natural barriers and defensive systems that Eleanor had designed based on her years of experience with security and warfare. From her Montana stronghold, Eleanor continued to conduct research into human psychology and behavior modification, using subjects that she acquired through various means. She also maintained her intelligence networks and continued to monitor the activities of government agencies and private organizations that might pose threats to her security. Eleanor's research during this period focused on the development of techniques for large-scale social control and manipulation. She had concluded that the traditional methods of maintaining power through force and intimidation were becoming obsolete in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. The future, she believed, belonged to those who could control human behavior through more subtle and sophisticated means. Working with the knowledge she had extracted from Professor Whitmore and other research subjects, Eleanor developed techniques for influencing human behavior on a mass scale. These techniques involved the use of carefully crafted propaganda, psychological conditioning, and chemical agents that could be introduced into food and water supplies to create desired behavioral changes in large populations. Eleanor's vision was to create a system of social control that would allow a small group of enlightened individuals to guide human civilization toward a more rational and efficient organization. She believed that most people were incapable of making intelligent decisions about their own lives, and that society would benefit from being controlled by individuals who possessed superior knowledge and capabilities. This vision of social engineering and control would later influence some of the most dangerous political movements of the 20th century, though Eleanor's direct role in developing these ideas would be carefully hidden from historical records. Her research into mass psychology and behavior modification provided the theoretical foundation for techniques that would later be used by totalitarian regimes around the world. Eleanor's activities in Montana continued for several years, during which she gradually expanded her influence and resources while maintaining her anonymity and security. She developed relationships with individuals in government and private organizations who shared her vision of social control and who were willing to provide her with resources and protection in exchange for access to her research and techniques. By the late 1890s, Eleanor had become the center of a new kind of conspiracy, one that was focused not on immediate financial gain or political power, but on the long-term transformation of human society. Her followers included scientists, government officials, military officers, and wealthy individuals who believed that traditional democratic institutions were inadequate for managing the complexities of modern civilization. This new conspiracy was far more dangerous than the consortium had ever been, because it was based on a coherent ideology and long-term vision rather than simple greed and self-interest. Eleanor's followers were willing to work patiently over decades to achieve their goals, using techniques of gradual infiltration and influence rather than the crude methods of bribery and intimidation that had characterized earlier conspiracies. The influence of Eleanor's ideas and techniques can be traced through many of the major political and social developments of the early 20th century, though her direct involvement was always carefully concealed. Her research into mass psychology influenced the development of modern propaganda techniques. Her methods of behavior modification provided the foundation for various programs of social engineering and population control. Her vision of rule by an enlightened elite inspired political movements that would reshape the world in ways that are still felt today. Eleanor Holloway herself disappeared from historical records sometime around 1900, though there is evidence that she continued to operate under various identities for many years afterward. Some researchers believe that she lived well into the 20th century, continuing to influence events from behind the scenes, while maintaining her anonymity and security. The official story, the one that appears in history books and government records, is that Eleanor Holloway never existed. The crimes and conspiracies that she was involved in have been attributed to other causes, or have been erased from the record entirely. The techniques she developed have been credited to other researchers, or have been classified as state secrets that cannot be discussed publicly. But the evidence of Eleanor's existence and influence can still be found by those who know where to look. Hidden in private archives and classified government documents, scattered through the memoirs and correspondence of individuals who encountered her, embedded in the theoretical foundations of various scientific and political movements, the traces of her activities remain. The story of Eleanor Holloway is a reminder that history is not always what it appears to be in official records and textbooks. Behind the sanitized narratives of progress and civilization lie darker truths about the individuals and forces that have shaped our world. Eleanor's story reveals how a single person with the right combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and opportunity can influence the course of human events in ways that are never officially acknowledged or understood. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Eleanor's story suggests that the techniques and ideas she developed have not disappeared with her. The methods of psychological manipulation and social control that she pioneered continue to be refined and applied by individuals and organizations that share her vision of human society as something to be managed and controlled rather than allowed to develop naturally. The legacy of Eleanor Holloway lives on in the shadows of our modern world, in the techniques used by governments to control their populations, in the methods employed by corporations to manipulate consumer behavior, in the strategies used by political movements to shape public opinion. Her influence can be seen in the gradual erosion of individual freedom and autonomy that has characterized much of the 20th and 21st centuries. Understanding Eleanor's story is important, not just as a piece of hidden history, but as a warning about the dangers that arise when brilliant individuals decide that they have the right to control and manipulate others for what they believe to be the greater good. Her story reminds us that the greatest threats to human freedom and dignity often come not from obvious villains, but from those who believe themselves to be enlightened saviors of humanity. The techniques that Eleanor developed for breaking down individual psychological defenses and creating states of mental submission are still being used today, though they have been refined and made more subtle through advances in psychology and technology. The vision of social control that she articulated continues to inspire individuals and organizations that believe they have the right to shape human society according to their own designs. Eleanor Holloway's story is ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the corruption that can result when individuals are given the ability to control and manipulate others without accountability or restraint. It is a reminder that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, not just against obvious threats, but against those who would gradually erode our autonomy and dignity in the name of progress and enlightenment. The fact that Eleanor's story has been systematically erased from official histories is itself a testament to the power and influence of the forces she helped to create. The conspiracy of silence that surrounds her activities is not just about protecting the reputation of individuals and institutions that were involved in her crimes. It is about maintaining the illusion that such things could never happen in a civilized society, that the techniques of control and manipulation she developed could never be used against ordinary citizens. But Eleanor's story proves that these techniques not only can be used but have been used and continue to be used by those who possess the power and resources to implement them. Her legacy is a reminder that the struggle for human freedom and dignity is never finished, that each generation must be vigilant against those who would use their intelligence and capabilities to control and manipulate others. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, with its new technologies of surveillance and control, its sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation, and its growing concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals and organizations, Eleanor Holloway's story becomes more relevant than ever. Her techniques may have been primitive by modern standards, but the principles underlying them remain the same. The desire to control and manipulate others, to shape human society according to one's own vision, to treat individual human beings as subjects for experimentation and control, these impulses are as strong today as they were in Eleanor's time. The story of Eleanor Holloway is not just a piece of forgotten history. It is a window into the darker aspects of human nature and a warning about the dangers that arise when those aspects are given free rein. It is a reminder that the greatest threats to human freedom and dignity often come not from external enemies, but from those among us who believe they have the right to control and manipulate others for what they consider to be the greater good. In the end, Eleanor Holloway's legacy is not just the specific crimes she committed or the techniques she developed. It is the demonstration that such things are possible, that human beings are capable of treating their fellow humans as objects to be controlled and manipulated, and that the institutions and systems we rely on to protect us from such abuse can themselves become instruments of oppression and control. Understanding Eleanor's story is the first step toward ensuring that such abuses never happen again. But it is only the first step. The real challenge is to create systems of accountability and restraint that prevent individuals and organizations from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that Eleanor wielded, and to maintain the vigilance necessary to detect and resist the subtle forms of manipulation and control that her successors continue to employ. The story of Eleanor Holloway may have been erased from the official histories, but it lives on in the techniques and ideas that continue to shape our world. By understanding her story, by recognizing the patterns of manipulation and control that she pioneered, we can better protect ourselves and future generations from those who would follow in her footsteps. Eleanor Holloway's name may be forgotten, but her influence remains. The question is whether we will learn from her story and take the steps necessary to prevent such abuses from happening again, or whether we will allow ourselves to be manipulated and controlled by her intellectual descendants. The choice is ours, but only if we have the knowledge and vigilance necessary to recognize the threats we face and the courage to resist them. This has been the disturbing case of Eleanor Holloway, a woman whose existence was erased from history because the truth of her activities was too dangerous to be allowed to survive. Her story is a reminder that the official version of history is not always the complete version, and that the most important lessons are often found in the stories that powerful forces have tried to suppress. Remember that the greatest threats to human freedom and dignity often hide behind facades of respectability and claims of good intentions. Remember that the techniques of control and manipulation are constantly being refined and adapted to new circumstances. And remember that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would use their power and intelligence to control and manipulate others. The story of Eleanor Holloway may be over, but the struggle against the forces she represented continues. It is up to each of us to ensure that her legacy of manipulation and control does not triumph over the human values of freedom, dignity, and respect for individual autonomy. Only by understanding the past can we hope to protect the future from those who would repeat Eleanor's crimes on an even grander scale.